Is there a neutral dialect of Spanish? I decided to make a video on this topic because of the many responses I've received on my video entitled, "Which Dialect of Spanish Should You Learn?" Although most viewers seem to have understood and agreed with the points I made in that video, others raised objections that I feel sort of missed the point. Anyway, if there are misunderstandings, I take 100% responsibility for not explaining myself properly, and this video is an attempt to rectify those misunderstandings. Today I'll address the following issues. Is there a neutral dialect of the Spanish language? What's the relationship between dialects and their parent language? And how should students of Spanish as a second language approach these concepts? So, is there a neutral dialect of Spanish? The most straightforward answer is that no, there is no neutral dialect. In other words, all regional dialects possess features that are diagnostic of that dialect. When a native from Argentina speaks with a native from Mexico, each one can potentially discern where the other is from by features they hear in one another's speech: word choice, word order, morphology, the bits and pieces that words are made up of, rhythm, stress, and intonation, the characteristic sing-song that each dialect has, which from here on out I'll refer to as prosody, and phonology. The same is true when an Ecuadorian speaks with a Guatemalan or a Chilean speaks with a Dominican. Of course, this is even true when someone from one part of a country speaks to someone from a different part of the same country, such as Colombian highlands and Colombian coast. No naturally occurring dialect is truly neutral, because no naturally occurring dialect is without distinguishing features. For purposes of dubbing movies and television shows so that they would be accessible and acceptable to as broad an audience as possible, entertainment production studios have spent much of the past century developing translations and voiceovers that are as free as possible from regionalisms. Some of what has been produced has a noticeable regional sound, usually Mexican, while some of it has been so heavily massaged to remove any distinguishing features that it comes across as insipid and artificial, even ugly to some listeners. It's important to realize that this discussion of a commercialized artificial Spanish is relevant to native speakers of Spanish and is almost completely meaningless for students of Spanish as a second language. I'll explain why it's meaningless to students later in this video. Moreover, none of this has anything whatsoever to do with the advice I gave in my previous video. Let me make a few things very clear. I do not suggest that there is or that there should be a neutral dialect of Spanish. And I don't advocate for some artificially neutral middle ground for producing or dubbing movies, TV, and entertainment, and certainly not as a standard that natives should emulate. But there is a concept of neutrality founded in legitimate concepts of sociolinguistics and dialectology, and it's potentially an organizing principle for students of Spanish as a second language. Let me try to explain a little better. In linguistics, there's a concept called markedness, which applies to related linguistic forms that exist in contrast to one another. An unmarked form is one that's more general, broad, regular, or common, while a marked form is more specific or a special case with more limited scope. The concept of markedness has applications in every branch of linguistics: syntax, semantics, morphology, phonetics and phonology, prosody, and probably anything else you could think of. The concept of markedness is extremely broad and deep, and I hesitated to even mention it in this video because there's no way I can do it justice, even if I dedicated a few videos to nothing else. In the end, I decided to introduce it because it can act as a framework for understanding dialectology and an organizing principle for students when studying phonology. I think I can make it understandable. I'm going to give it a try. Let's start with this example. As I described in great detail in a previous video, some Spanish dialects pronounce all S's all the time, while some dialects reduce S in some phonetic contexts. So, for example, in some dialects this word is pronounced escuela, while in others it's normally pronounced something like escuela. So which pronunciation is unmarked and which is marked? Of the two pronunciations, I think that most of us intuitively understand that the unmarked version, the version that's general, broad, regular, or common, is the one in which the S is pronounced, while the marked version, the one that's narrower, less common, irregular, or special case, is the one in which the S is reduced. But are there ways of actually demonstrating that that's true? Yes, there are. Several, in fact. The simplest and most straightforward is that native speakers of S-reducing dialects often fully articulate these S's when speaking slowly and enunciating carefully. The same speaker may reduce certain S's sometimes, but pronounce them other times. So S-reduction is not a parallel and mutually exclusive paradigm, but more like a subset or special case of S pronunciation. This is only one of several ways that we know that from the standpoint of dialectology, S reduction is the marked form. Similarly, every phoneme in the Spanish language that exhibits dialectal variation, in other words, a sound whose patterns of pronunciation differ from one dialect to another, can be analyzed using the theory of markedness, and unmarked and marked dialectal variations can be identified. Alright, so why would anyone care to do that? Of what benefit would it be to categorize all the unmarked and marked dialectal forms of a language? Well, for one, it can be used as an organizational framework for understanding the big picture of dialectology. Every dialect has a combination of unmarked and marked dialectal forms. The particular number, type, and pattern of marked forms are what give each dialect its unique sound. Unmarked dialectal forms are what dialects generally have in common with one another, and unmarked forms are what all dialects have in common with the parent language they share. What do I mean by the parent language they share? If we say that Peninsular, Argentine, Mexican, Ecuadorian, and Dominican are all dialects of Spanish, what do we mean by of Spanish? What is the Spanish language of which each of these is a dialect? Where is it found? Who speaks it? This trying to define a language in relationship to its constituent dialects is a very complex topic with no universal agreement. A reasonable viewpoint is that the parent language they all share emerges from the confluence of all the dialects. It's perceived by native speakers to exist, to influence the dialects and be influenced by them, and to tie all the dialects together. And yet, no one anywhere actually speaks it or has ever spoken it as a native dialect, nor could they, since it's ultimately an abstraction. A visual representation that I really like is this dome supported by pillars. In this model, the dialects are the pillars and the language is the dome. The dialects support and contribute to the language, they influence it and are influenced by it. The language emerges from the dialects. With regard to markedness, the pillars are distinguished each by their particular blend of unmarked and marked dialectal forms, while the dome is comprised entirely of unmarked dialectal forms. And if we imagine a person next to our dome, the person has direct access to the concrete pillar dialects and can only contemplate the abstract thing that is the dome language. Another use for markedness is as an organizing principle in deciding how to teach the language. Should we teach one of the marked dialectal variants of a given phoneme, or should we teach the unmarked form? I think it's fairly obvious that we should teach the unmarked form. Going back to pronunciation of S, would it be better to start out teaching students to pronounce all their S's, or would it be better to teach S reduction? Well, consider that a majority of Spanish speakers worldwide pronounce all S's all the time. And even S-reducing native speakers pronounce normally at least some reduced S's when speaking slowly and enunciating carefully. Moreover, pronouncing all S's normally doesn't create confusion or misunderstanding between speakers of different dialects, while omitting some S's has the potential for confusion. Native Spanish speakers who pronounce all their S's sometimes say that they have to listen a little more carefully in order to keep up with S-reducing natives. But to my knowledge, the reverse is not true. In other words, speakers of S-reducing dialects don't claim that they have a hard time understanding because the person they're speaking with pronounces too many S's. And similar logic applies to all dialectal variants. There is good justification for teaching the general, broad, regular, or common dialectal variant of any given pronunciation, and allowing students to learn the narrower, less common, irregular, or special case variant on their own once they're immersed in a real-world dialect. A consequence of this approach is that the version of Spanish phonology we teach to students is not based on any single real-world dialect. It is in effect an abstraction that emerges from the confluence of all the natural dialects. So there are some interesting questions that arise from this discussion of markedness and dialects. One of them is this: are there any natural, real-world dialects that use mostly unmarked dialectal phonological forms? Maybe not 100% unmarked like this, but mostly unmarked? Maybe like this? Yes, there are. I said earlier that all regional dialects possess features that are diagnostic of that dialect, and that some of those features were word choice, word order, morphology, prosody, and phonology. And this is true. But notice that phonology is only one of those categories, and while all dialects have their characteristic words and phrases, and some have unique morphological features, and all dialects have their own unique sing-song, there are some dialects that employ relatively few marked dialectal phonological features. We can observe this by comparing the dialects of Santiago, Dominican Republic, and Bogota, Colombia. Each has its own characteristic words, phrases, and prosody, but the phonology of Santiago includes S aspiration, S hypercorrection, N velarization, reduction of intervocalic D and AR verb participles, dropping of final R in infinitive verbs, interchanging of flapped R and L, and vocalization of flapped R and L, what Dominicans refer to as hablar con la I. All of these are marked dialectal forms, and there are undoubtedly others I'm forgetting right now. The Spanish of Bogota, on the other hand, employs the unmarked equivalent to each of Santiago's marked forms, and it employs relatively few marked phonological forms of its own. Just a few comparatively subtle peculiarities with S, the velar fricative, and the obstruents in limited phonological contexts, and some peculiarities with Y and double L and trilled R, but only among people of certain ages or social classes. This is what native speakers mean when they say that the Spanish of Bogota, Colombia is more neutral than the Spanish of Santiago, Dominican Republic. It isn't that the Spanish of Bogota has no distinguishing features, because it has many, or that its phonology has nothing whatsoever unique about it, because it does. It's that the Spanish of Bogota employs fewer marked phonological forms, and that some of the marked forms it employs are quite subtle. One thing that's very interesting is that, like the Spanish of Bogota, the Spanish of Mexico City employs relatively few marked dialectal phonological forms. And yet these two dialects sound quite different from one another to native Spanish speakers. How can that be if they pronounce most sounds similarly? Well, first off, they have very different prosody, which is a surprisingly large part of what we perceive as someone's accent. And of course, they each have their local words and phrases. What's more, the ears of native speakers are highly attuned to very small differences in articulation. And while the phonological differences between Bogota and Mexico City may be comparatively subtle, natives have no problem hearing them, especially when combined with the not at all subtle differences in prosody. I've only mentioned 3 dialects here, one with a larger number of marked dialectal phonological forms, and 2 with many fewer marked forms. But a similar analysis could be made of any dialect. There are Spanish dialects that have few marked dialectal phonological forms, some that have some intermediate number, and some that have a large number. Another interesting question is, can any given native speaker sound more neutral if he or she wants to? Yes, not only is this possible, but it happens all the time without people even thinking about it. When speaking casually with another native speaker of the same dialect, people employ all their marked dialectal forms. But when speaking slowly and enunciating carefully, for whatever reason, maybe when speaking in a formal situation or with someone of a different dialect, or especially with a non-native speaker, people intuitively switch to more unmarked forms. They do it without even thinking about it. What's more, some native speakers simply use fewer marked dialectal forms than others. There are people who come from an S-reducing dialect who don't reduce S much. There are people whose native dialect sibilates the R who instead trill the R, and so on with any marked form you can think of. While it's true that all dialects have distinguishing features, it's possible for someone to use fewer of his or her dialect's distinguishing features. And in common parlance, most people would call this speaking in a more standard or neutral accent. Can you, as a non-native speaker, learn and use unmarked Spanish phonology and still develop a regional-sounding accent? Yes. As we discussed when comparing Bogota and Mexico City, phonology is only part of what makes up someone's regional accent. A surprisingly important component of anyone's accent is prosody. If you're a beginning or intermediate student and you study dialectally unmarked Spanish phonology now, what people think of as standard or neutral phonology, and then in the future you spend time living in a particular Spanish-speaking country, you'll likely pick up some of the prosody and other features of the local dialect, and you'll do this without even thinking about it or trying. It'll just happen. Learning unmarked dialectal phonological forms in the beginning won't prevent you from developing a more local regional sound once you're immersed in Spanish-speaking language and culture. In my previous video, I recommended watching dubbed Disney movies as an aid to Spanish students in learning good pronunciation. Native speakers have many opinions on this subject, all of which I find extremely interesting. However, as much as I've loved the discussion on this topic with native speakers, these viewpoints have almost zero relevance to students of Spanish as a second language. If you're watching a Disney video produced for general release across Latin America, it doesn't matter whether it's one that natives perceive as being artificially neutral. It doesn't matter whether it's one that natives perceive as sounding strongly Mexican. In both cases, the phonology will be unmarked dialectal forms, or close enough that you as a student won't be able to tell the difference. And unless you're some kind of foreign language prodigy, you as a non-native speaker probably won't be capable of even hearing, much less imitating, those subtler aspects of pronunciation and prosody about which natives have various opinions. My recommendation that students use Disney videos as a study aid is not an endorsement of either artificially neutral Spanish or Mexican Spanish in dubbing. It's also not because I believe there's a truly neutral Spanish dialect, or that there should be, or that Disney videos represent a superior version of the Spanish language, or any such nonsense. I recommend them for students because they're useful, which is a completely different subject from the ones native speakers find important. Now, throughout this video, I've used phrases like dialectally unmarked phonology and unmarked dialectal forms in order to be as precise as possible. But nobody who hasn't studied linguistics would use phrases like that or know what they mean. Ordinary people use words like standard and neutral to refer to the same idea, and while some people take these as fighting words and want to argue about whether such things as standard and neutral exist, it's demonstrably true that a system of unmarked dialectal phonology does exist, and I don't see any reason to quibble about what we call it. So when a native Spanish speaker says that they like X, Y, or Z dialect because it sounds neutral, or a Spanish teacher suggests that they teach standard pronunciation, I'm pretty sure I know what they mean, and I don't feel the need to correct them about it. I'm going to end this video by apologizing to my friends on the other side of the pond who speak the Spanish of Spain. Please understand that I can only talk about what I know, and most of my background is in Latin American Spanish. I love the people, culture, and languages of Spain, but I fear that if I try to say anything authoritative about the sociolinguistics or dialectology of Spanish in Spain, I'll say something mistaken, so I prefer not to comment. Any Spaniards who'd like to contribute to this discussion from the perspective of Spain, I would love to read your comments. Alright, this has been our discussion of unmarked dialectal phonology. If you've learned something from this video, please give it a like, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss out on future content. If you have any questions about the Spanish language, please feel free to ask in the comments section of any of my videos. I keep a running list of viewers' questions that I consult when deciding what video to make next.